So, I talk about forest health a lot and in different ways. Forest health means lots of different things. And I think that's one of the most kind of challenging things about it is that it is hard to define exactly what is healthy and what does forest health mean. Now, most of the time when we're talking forest health, we're talking about a balance between woodlands and forests that are growing vigorously, that are sustainable into the future, that are doing the things we want them to do from biodiversity perspective, from a wildlife perspective, but also that they're meeting our management objectives. And different people have different goals for their woods. So it's no surprise that health might look a little bit different depending on what you're interested in. But nonetheless, I think that there are some kind of common characteristics there in terms of when we're talking about what's healthy, a lot of times in our woods, what are things we're looking for? We're looking for vigorously growing trees. We're looking for a diversity of different trees, of different species, of different shrubs, of different plants, of different wildlife that they're supporting, and that there's the potential for that to continue in the future. That you have regeneration of the trees that you want to be seeing. You've got those seedlings that are growing into saplings that are growing into big trees in the future. So if there is some disturbance, those stands can recover from that. Now, the flip side of that might be a lot of trees that are dying, that are damaged, a lot of invasive species that are preventing those things from happening. And those are some of the common characteristics that I think about in our forest and what to look for. But, if we just think about some different areas, and you might be familiar with some spots that look like this picture right here. Is this woodland healthy? Is this stand healthy? Well, it's not a trick question. No, it's not looking great. And what you're seeing there is lots of dead trees. Now, this is just a snapshot in time. Maybe it's just the wintertime, those trees don't have their leaves on. But what you're seeing there are trees that have been killed by the emerald ash borer. And if you have a stand like this with lots of trees that have been killed, that to me is a major red flag. Versus if it was just a tree or two that had been killed, that's less of a serious issue long term for the health of your woods. At the same time, let's say that instead of being killed, these trees were trees that have lost their leaves due to some insect that's defoliating. Is that healthy? Well, again, it depends. It depends on what happens from here. Do those trees bounce back from that? Or long term, are there going to be impacts to that? Most of the time, the trees are incredibly resilient. They can bounce back from a lot of different things, especially a lot of the native issues you might see pop up. But there are other invasive issues out there that can cause problems. How about this stand? Does this look healthy to you? Well, on the one hand, what you're seeing here is an area that has been totally overrun by the invasive plant winter creeper. So you can see it's just carpeting the ground there, and that evergreen shiny leaves are carpeting everything. You don't have a diversity of other things in understory. All you have is winter creeper, and then it's growing up into the trees. Now, is that a problem? It depends kind of on what your goals are. It's not a good thing from a biodiversity perspective. All you have is winter creeper in the understory. It's not a good thing from a regeneration perspective. That invasive plant is choking other things out, preventing them from growing there. So maybe the trees that it's growing up, even if it doesn't really directly impact those, because it doesn't tend to strangle them, it just grows up them, it certainly could have an impact long term in what's going to happen in that stand. If you lose those trees that are there, those invasive plants, and this is an example of winter creeper, but there are lots of other ones, they're going to prevent what you want to see happening in your woods. And then this is a different picture. Here's an area that has a tree that's tipped up and kind of fallen over. Now, is that healthy? And a lot of times someone might see this and it's not healthy for that individual tree, right? That tree is not healthy. But that's different from if that stand is healthy, if that area is healthy. It's totally normal and in some ways good to have a dead tree or two in your woods. Wildlife use those, and frankly, it's impossible not to have a little bit of that because trees are living creatures. They're gonna grow and naturally age and eventually die. But if you're seeing a lot of that, that's a red flag, a cause for concern. If you're just seeing that occasionally, it might not be a big deal. And knowing that difference is really key, because 1 or 2 dead trees in the woods is not a problem, but a lot of them could be a sign of a more important issue there that's causing that. So in addition to all of this, there are different considerations for different types of stands and different goals. So if you have an area that was recently harvested, what you're really trying to do is see, is there regeneration happening that's going to be the next generation of those trees? And if not, what needs to be done to get that happening? Is it that there's a lot of invasive plants everywhere that's preventing that? Is it that there's too much deer browse? And ideally doing that on the front end so that you're set up for success. On the other hand, if you've got a lot of large trees and you have no plans for a harvest, you still might get a disturbance that comes in and impacts things. But what you're thinking about is going to be a little bit different, because you might be most interested in the health of those large trees, those dominant trees. What's going on with them? Are there things that are impacting them, as well as thinking diversity for the long term? So there's no one size fits all approach when it comes to forest health or what you might want to do. There's no single prescription out there, because everyone's stands are different and every woodland is a little bit different. So it just depends. It depends on what you want. Now, there are, however, a few kind of major forest health threats across the state that I think it's worthwhile to be aware of, because if you don't know about them, you can't be working to manage them or stop them. And sometimes, there's not a lot we can do about these things that are headed our way, but there's a lot you can do in how we respond to them to set your woods up for success long term. So these might be things like invasive insects and diseases. These 2 pictures show 2 different invasive insects that cause major problems in our state. And I'll talk a little bit more about one of them, the emerald ash borer. But this other one is the hemlock woolly adelgid. And both of those are invasive. They're from somewhere else in the world. And when they came here, our trees don't really have defenses for them, and they're killing them off. Now, we can't necessarily stop them in their tracks. That cat is out of the bag here, but there's a lot we can be doing to maybe protect individual trees, or to think about what impact is this going to have on your woods, and then how can you be managing to offset that long term. Invasive plants are another one, and I showed that picture with winter creeper, but here's a picture of bush honeysuckle, another invasive plant that really takes over in our understories. And you can see just how dense it is. This is really early spring, so it leaves out, one of the first things to leaf out, and it just forms this dense blanket that other things aren't going to get through. It's going to decrease diversity of stands. It's going to inhibit that regeneration that we want to be seeing naturally. These invasive plants, in some cases, they can impact the health of an individual tree, but a lot of times they're changing things kind of more fundamentally in our stands. There's also a legacy of past management. So if you've got something like a stand that has been overgrown, in the case of some of our pines in the state, we've got pine stands that should have been thinned a while ago and weren't, and they're declining. That's something that's really impacted by what happened in the past. The same thing with some of the harvesting practices. If you have a stand that was high graded, that could impact your health going forward. And then I did want to mention extreme weather, because we know we've had some extreme weather events. Whether it's a tornado like in this picture here, or flooding, or other things that have been happening across the state, really impacting not just our trees, but a lot of different things, and kind of thinking about what impact that's going to have long term. And there are a lot of other things. A lot of the other things that you might see popping up on your trees might look bad, but long term are less likely to be a major issue for the health of your tree. I'm thinking about all of the different foliar issues that the tree might have some leaves that don't look so great. And the truth is, our trees, they host a lot of different insects, and sometimes those insects feed on them. But a lot of those, especially those native issues, those are things that our trees have dealt with for a long time. And some years might be worse and some years might be better, but they're unlikely to drive things in the same way that the invasive insects, diseases, and plants, the legacy of past management, and these extreme weather events are. So Let's talk about one of those, and that's the emerald ash borer, because that's such a big issue in our state. That's an invasive insect. Here you can see this metallic green beetle, whose larvae tunnel under the bark of trees, right in the vascular system of ash trees specifically. They are really damaging to white and green ash, especially, which are the most common ash trees in our state. Across the state, it was about 4% of the trees before the emerald ash borer arrived, a little bit less now. But then that tunneling will be enough to damage the tree and kill it. And here's a map of where emerald ash borer is currently known to occur in Kentucky. What you can take away from this map is that it's pretty much the whole state. It's moving into the western part of the state right now. And I think what's worth noting about this is that where you are in the state is going to mean different things. It's if you're in this northern or central part of Kentucky, you're talking about dealing with a legacy of having lost ash. So you've lost a lot of trees that used to be dominant. You might have invasive species popping up everywhere. Do you have other species filling those gaps or not? Versus if you're in this part of the state, in the western part, you can expect to see emerald ash borer headed your way soon. And you've got more options there right now. If you have a lot of ash, it could be worth considering if you want to have a harvest preemptively, knowing you're going to lose those trees anyways, to give you some funds to offset other management. Because what we've seen a lot of is that once the trees start going downhill, they become really dangerous. And that's a problem, both for you getting in your woods, but also the quality decreases really rapidly. So if you want to do something about it, do it early on. And you want to manage those invasive plants early on, because emerald ash borer is its own problem, but it can certainly make the invasive plant problem worse. And so, if you're in those parts of the state, what you might look for are these dead branches, thinning crown, maybe insect holes in tree. And here's that tunneling that I told you about happening under the bark of that larva, the emerald ash borer larva. But many other places are just seeing dead trees with lots of bark flaking off, or a lot of trees that have snapped in half, that have died and are a hazard. And are kind of changing our stands, changing our woodlands really deeply. Because if you had just an ash tree or two, it's no big deal. Your woods can probably tolerate that just fine. But if you had a lot of them, that might need some more active management from you to set the stage for what you want long term. And so what to do now, it really depends. It depends on the scenario you're talking about, how much ash were there to begin with. In a landscape setting, and there were a lot of ash trees that were planted in urban landscapes, there are some great treatment options, insecticide treatment options for ash trees that can protect them from the emerald ash borer. And you could certainly do that in your woodland setting too. But realistically, the costs associated with that, while a great idea for landscape trees, may not be feasible on a large scale in your woods, especially because this is something that's going to have to be repeated over time. On the flip side, thinking about, what is it going to mean when that ash is gone, or now that it has gone? Are you seeing the species that you want filling in those gaps? Or is it a bunch of ash regeneration, which is very common because the seedlings that are coming up from those ash species, they might grow fine for a little while until they're killed by that emerald ash borer again. So thinking about that long term, how do we deal with that forest health threat? I think laying the foundation for success post emerald ash borer is definitely something that woodland owners can be thinking about and working with professionals on, because while emerald ash borer, and I'm just giving this as one example of a forest health threat, is bad, you can set the stage for a bright future. And we're fortunate to be in an area here in Kentucky where we grow trees really well. And there are lots of other great species that, if we can encourage their growth and encourage them to fill in some of those gaps left by ash, that's a real positive. So just one example with that emerald ash borer, but we could talk hemlock woolly adelgid and other invasive insects and diseases. But I want to give a little bit of time for invasive plants as well, because that's another major forest health threat. And there are lots of them out there. So what do we mean by invasive? We mean that it's not from here, it causes problems, and it can take over. And that's important with our plants, because we saw with the winter creeper and with the bush honeysuckle just taking over in that understory. It's not from here, it's from some other part of the world. And there, maybe it's a good player and it's kind of more imbalanced with some of the other plants that it naturally interacts with. But here, they seem to be able to take off and form these really dense stands. And these are just examples of a couple different invasive plants. They're both pretty, but they can really dominate and prevent a diversity of species you want to be seeing. So why are they a problem in our woods? Well, first, they get in the way of your goals. You can't be doing some of the things that you want to be doing if you have a sea of invasive plants taking over. So, for example, if you had a harvest and you've got a sea of microstegium or stilt grass that has taken over after that, you're not going to be seeing the growth that you want to down the road. It could really set you back in your plans. They also decrease biodiversity, whether that's of plants or of the things that depend on the plants, the insects and the wildlife from there. If you just have a sea of bush honeysuckle, maybe some of those animals like bush honeysuckle and are going to thrive, but certainly not the diversity you could get otherwise. And then some of these can actually change these systems to their benefit. I mentioned that with the arrival of emerald ash borer, we've seen more invasive plants there. So once you get one invasive species, it seems to be easier and easier for more invasive species to arrive. And they can really take advantage of disturbances, whether they're natural, like a tornado, or things that we've done, like a harvest, or in this case, something that is growing alongside a trail. This is vinca, which is a common ornamental plant, beautiful in its ornamental setting, really nice ground cover, but it doesn't stay put, and it will take advantage if the opportunity presents itself and become a problem. There are lots of different invasive plants out there. We could talk about invasive trees that compete with our native species for sunlight and can grow faster than they can outcompete them. Things like tree of heaven, princess tree or paulownia, or increasingly in central and northern Kentucky, Callery pear, which is taking over a lot of old field sites. And here you can see it probably in next month. It'll look just like this, where all the old fields that you thought, oh, this is growing up nicely into some nice woods, actually it's just a sea of Callery pear, these trees that are growing so densely that nothing else is really underneath and preventing the growth of other species that you want to see. We could talk invasive shrubs that are blanketing the understory, really keeping sunlight from getting down there and inhibiting a diversity of species. Things like multiflora rose, autumn olive, or bush honeysuckle. We could talk invasive vines that can grow over areas and smother vegetation. Sometimes they can even grow up into trees and increase the likelihood that those trees are impacted by wind. Things like kudzu we've all heard of. I mentioned winter creeper earlier, Japanese honeysuckle, but there are many more. There are many more of all of these. There are invasive spring ephemerals, invasive grasses, and other invasive herbaceous plants. And really, I think the most effective way to manage invasive plants is to keep them from arriving to begin with. If you can keep them from being the problem in your woods, that's the goal, right? But for most landowners, it's not that. It's playing catch up. You've noticed you have a problem. Maybe you already have tons of honeysuckle in your woods. What do you do about that? I think it's really important to prioritize, to think about what are your goals? What's getting in the way of those goals? In this case, maybe the honeysuckle is not impacting these big trees, but if you were to have some disturbance in there, you wouldn't have the growth that you want to be seeing, the advanced regeneration, or the seedlings, the saplings that are there ready to go because you've got that there. Then what are your resources? I've heard from a lot of different folks that a really good way to think about invasive plant management would be to start small and start with a good area, an area that you just want to make better. and then work out from there instead of trying to go to the very worst of the worst spots where you can spend a lot of effort and a lot of time and not have as big of an impact. Do what you can accomplish each year in a sustainable way, because invasive plant management is something you need to plan for sustained and long-term over time. You can do a lot in one year, but then if you wait a few years, those invasive plants, they are so tenacious and they grow so fast that it's really got to be something that you can maintain over time. So let's just give one example. I've mentioned bush honeysuckle already. What do? You've got a sea of it in your woods. Welcome to the club, right? You've got lots of folks who are in your shoes as well. How do you manage it? It depends. It depends on what you've got there, the size of the plants, the infestation, what else is growing around, making sure you want to keep the good stuff and get rid of the things that you don't want. Do you have small trees of bush honeysuckle, like in this picture? Do you have a lot of smaller stuff? That all depends. One thing I would emphasize is that with bush honeysuckle or a lot of our woody species, any control you do must control the roots. Otherwise, it will resprout vigorously. And that's important to think about because you might be tempted to do some management options, but you can spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and not get a lot of results. And that's not what we want, right? We want to maximize our efforts. So again, let's think about bush honeysuckle. If you just had a few smaller plants, like in this picture here, or just smaller plants, you can certainly mechanically remove those. You could hand pull those. They even sell different devices for slightly larger plants that you can kind of pop them out of the ground. You can, as long as you're getting the roots out of there, you can definitely do that. You could also do a foliar herbicide spray of that smaller stuff. It's really a great time to do that is late in the year in the fall, because what bush honeysuckle keeps its leaves much longer than most of our natives do. So while everything else has lost its leaves, bush honeysuckle still has its leaves on. You can really target what you're doing to that invasive plant you don't want and save all of the things you do want to keep. And so that's, a good thing. But let's say you've got bigger plants. What are some options there? Again, you need to kill that root system. So one really commonly used approach with bush honeysuckle is called a cut stump herbicide treatment. Like right here, you can see this person cutting the stems and then spraying the herbicide on those cut stems. That's a good way to really target your treatment just to that plant. You don't use much herbicide, and you can target it to the root system of the honeysuckle you want to get rid of. There are lots and lots of other approaches though, and that's just scratching the surface. So, that's another thing I want to emphasize, is that do your research when you're dealing with something new. Don't just use what you already have sitting around. There are some different approaches that are going to be more effective for some things and less for others. So no matter what you're doing with invasive plants, you've got a plan for continued monitoring and removal. You want diversity. You don't just want no invasives, right? So you want to plan for that. And this is just a success story picture where you can see a sea of winter creeper right over here. And then where it's been removed, you've got beautiful trilliums coming up just the next year that we're just waiting for that winter creeper to be gone. And you can just see a huge impact. So that's just a little bit on some of the key forest health threats in our state. But the best thing you can do if you're dealing with issues is to reach out to some of the resources. So that could be your county agents. Every single county in the state of Kentucky has a county office with fabulous agents who can help you if you have questions. You can also, of course, reach out to extension specialists like myself, like Billy, like Jonathan Larson in entomology and others. And then the Kentucky Division of Forestry is a wonderful resource, both their service foresters, but also their forest health coordinator, someone like Alexandra Blevins right here, who deals with these forest health issues on a regular basis and can also talk with you about what's happening in your woods. There are also consulting foresters, other technical service providers who can accomplish some of the things that might need to get done in your woods, like invasive plant management. There are cost share funding opportunities through NRCS that might be an option for you if you're trying to deal with invasive plant management or other forest health issues. And then I also wanted to mention the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They've got other great things going on. So all of these resources might look at it from a slightly different perspective, but have a lot of good information for you about the health of your woods and what you can be doing to promote it. So with that, I want to wrap things up, but I also want to invite all of you to, if you want to learn more about forest health, what are some of those threats out there, but also what's being done to manage them, to come to our Kentucky Forest Health Conference next Wednesday, February 8th. If you scan this QR code, it'll take you to the registration link. We've got speakers coming from across the region and beyond to talk about different things like, hemlock woolly adelgid. I mentioned that earlier, an invasive insect that's killing our hemlocks. There's exciting research being done to try to fight that insect. So you'll hear about that. You'll hear about different threats that are out there and how people are managing those. So I hope to see you then.